He was 42 years old, $200 to his name, and everyone in that office, including himself, believed it was already too late. They were wrong about almost everything. Houston, 2004. A man walks into a public library at 10:30 at night because it is the only place he can think of that is both free and quiet. His name doesn't matter yet. What matters is what he's carrying. A legal pad, a nearly empty checking account, and the particular kind of shame that comes not from failure, but from running out of road. He's 42. He thought by 42, he'd have something to show. He doesn't. The library doors slide open and the fluorescent light washes over him, and for a moment he just stands there, blinking, like a man deciding whether to walk back out. He doesn't walk back out. 3 weeks before this moment, a judge signed a divorce settlement, and the math was simple and brutal. The house went with her, the savings split, the legal fees took the rest. What was left sat in a checking account, $200, and greed had stared at that number so long the digits stopped meaning anything. The legal pad on his kitchen table was covered in subtraction. Groceries, rent, utilities, the minimum on a credit card he hated having. Every column ended the same way. He wasn't broke in the dramatic sense. No collectors calling, no late notices taped to the door. He was broke in the quieter, harder sense. The kind where you still go to work and smile, and nobody knows. And the knowing that nobody knows somehow makes it worse. The next morning, the office felt like an insult. Regional insurance, a floor of beige cubicles, horizontal blinds, the particular smell of burnt coffee, and someone's microwaved oatmeal. And right there at the water cooler, before most people had even logged in, was Theo Barker. Theo was the kind of man who walked into a room like he'd already won something. Sandy blonde hair, always slightly off, a patterned tie today, green diamonds on red, and that gold watch catching the fluorescent light every time he gestured, which was constantly. He was pitching a biotech stock to 3 colleagues who were nodding like he was a priest. Greed poured his coffee, listened for 30 seconds, and felt something he couldn't name. Not contempt exactly. Something closer to envy for the confidence, which was worse. Patrice Okafor had seen it before. She was standing behind the glass wall of her office, reading glasses on the beaded chain resting against her structured burgundy blazer, and she was watching Theo the way you watch weather, not alarmed, just noting the pressure system. She'd been office manager long enough to have watched 2 or 3 Theos cycle through. The confident pitch, the lunch bought on a hot day, the quiet unraveling later. She didn't say any of this. She just looked across the floor and caught Greed's eye through the glass, and they held that look for maybe 2 seconds. No words, just the recognition of 2 people who had both quietly decided not to join in. Then she picked up her coffee and looked back at her screen, and Greed walked to his desk, and neither of them said a thing about it all day. That evening, Greed took the bus to the Houston Public Library. He told himself it was just to get out of the apartment, which was too quiet and too empty since the settlement. That was mostly true, but somewhere on the bus, he remembered reading the word index fund in a magazine 6 months ago and not knowing what it meant, and he thought, I have 3 hours and I have nowhere to be. He sat down at a terminal in the back row, away from the teenagers doing homework and the man 2 seats over, watching a grainy video with the sound all the way up. He typed the words into the search bar slowly, like he was being careful not to spook the thing. And then he started reading. He read for 2.5 hours. Most of it was dry. Expense ratios, diversification, fund structures. He clicked through, skimmed, moved on. Then he found an old investing primer, probably scanned from a book printed in 1997, and buried in the second chapter was a single sentence that made him stop moving entirely. The market has never, over any 20-year period in its history, finished lower than it started. He read it twice, then a third time, slower. He was 42. 20 years from 42 was 62. He did not know how to feel about 62. But he pulled a blank index card from a stack near the printer, uncapped his pen, and wrote the sentence out in full, slowly, the way you write something you want to remember. He folded it once and put it in his wallet, behind the expired insurance card. He didn't look at the primer again. He went back the next evening, not to read, he'd already read enough. He sat back down at the same terminal, pulled up the brokerage site he'd bookmarked, and opened an account with $100 of the $200 he had left. He chose the broadest, plainest index fund listed, No special strategy, no analyst forecast, no story behind it. Then he set up an automatic contribution, $50 a month, the first of every month, and clicked confirm before he could think about it too long. The confirmation screen appeared. A number, a fund name, an account number he would mostly ignore for the next 20 years. He read it once, closed the browser, and stood up. He wasn't proud. He wasn't relieved. He was just done doing nothing, and that was different from either one. The walk home was 12 blocks. Houston in fall still carries heat into the evening, and the sidewalks held the day's warmth up through his shoes. He was passing the row of ground-floor apartments on Elgin when he saw the light in Rosa's window, warm and amber and flickering a little with the movement inside. She was at the easel, brush moving. She looked up, spotted him through the glass, and knocked twice on the window frame with her knuckle, the way you knock on a table when you mean hello. He stopped. She pushed the window up. She said, "Hey, you look different tonight." He stood there for a second and said, "I did something." She leaned on the sill, paint on her flannel sleeve, and asked, "Good something?" He thought about it. He said he wasn't sure yet. She laughed, told him to let her know, and went back to the canvas. He kept walking. He didn't know it then, but she just asked the only question that mattered. 6 months passed the way ordinary months do, quietly, without announcement. The account sat at $382. Greed had not looked at it more than twice. Meanwhile, Theo had been loud about a telecom stock for 4 months, and one Thursday he walked into the office carrying 4 bags of takeout from the good Thai place on Westheimer and announced he'd just tripled his position. He set the bags on the breakroom table like a man planting a flag. Colleagues crowded in. Someone said, "Theo, you legend." Greed sat at the end of the table, ate his lunch, and said nothing about the $382. He thought about mentioning it once, then thought about what there was to say. I have $382 in a fund nobody here has heard of, and decided there wasn't much of a story in that yet. Then the floor fell out of the market. It wasn't sudden if you were paying attention, but most people weren't paying attention. They were paying attention to the number going up, which is a different thing entirely. By early 2001, Greed's account had dropped 28%. He checked it once at the library terminal and sat with the number for a while, 352 contributions and reinvested dividends. And right now the account showed roughly $1,800, less on paper than he'd put in. He closed the browser. He did not feel the urge to sell because selling meant having a conversation with himself about what he was selling into, and he didn't have an answer for that. He checked the card in his wallet instead. The sentence was still there. He put the wallet away and didn't check the account again for 4 months. Theo took it badly. Not the dramatic badly. No shouting, no scene. Just the quiet ground-level kind that is harder to watch. He'd lost $14,000 in 6 weeks. For 2 weeks after the crash, he came in late, shirt slightly wrinkled, the gold watch gone from his wrist. He stopped pitching at the water cooler. He sat at his desk with his reading glasses on, even though he never used to need them at his desk. And he stared at things without quite seeing them. Greed noticed all of it. He didn't say anything because there was nothing useful to say. Not, "I told you so," which would have been unkind, and not, "It'll come back," which he didn't actually know. He just watched, the way you watch someone you've worked next to for years, and felt something uncomfortable that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite guilt, but lived somewhere between the two. By 2003, Greed had gotten a small raise, enough to move his automatic contribution from $50 a month to $100. It wasn't a decision he labored over. The extra $50 was either going to sit in checking earning nothing, or it was going to go in the fund. He chose the fund. One morning before work, he sat in a diner booth on Main with a coffee and a paper napkin and did the math the old-fashioned way. No spreadsheet, just pencil and the compound interest formula he'd memorized from the library printout. He started with what he had, plugged in $100 a month, assumed 8% average annual return, and ran it forward 18 years. When he got to the end of the napkin, he stopped and looked at the number for a long time. He set the pencil down. He picked up his coffee. He sat very still. The number was large enough that he didn't trust it, which meant he needed to check it twice, which meant he was going to be late for work. He checked the math a second time on the back of the napkin. Same number. He sat with it long enough that the waitress refilled his coffee without asking. Then he folded the napkin carefully in thirds, the way you fold something you mean to keep, and slipped it into his jacket pocket. He did not call anyone. He did not show anyone. This is the part that sounds easy in the telling and is not easy at all. He had a number in his pocket that changed everything he thought about the next 20 years of his life, and he told absolutely no one, and he ordered a second cup of coffee, and he went to work. The discipline wasn't the math. The math was just arithmetic. The discipline was the silence, choosing, deliberately, not to perform the knowing, not to let it become a story he told before it was true. Her name was Hana Fujimoto, and she walked into that office in January 2014 the way most 27-year-olds start a new job, slightly overdressed, slightly overwhelmed, clicking through HR paperwork she barely read. She told Greed this herself, laughing about it in the break room one Thursday afternoon. She'd meant to contribute 6% to whatever fund was listed first, and she'd accidentally clicked the maximum employer match into a broad index fund because the form was confusing and she just wanted to finish. That was it. No strategy, no research. Just a wrong click and a confirmation email she almost deleted. She showed him the enrollment sheet like it was a funny story. He looked at it for a long time without saying anything. Because it wasn't funny. It was the exact thing he'd done in a Houston library 10 years earlier, except she'd done it by accident in 4 minutes. He ran her numbers that night at the kitchen table. If Hana never touched that account, never added $1 beyond the automatic match, never thought about it again, by 55, she'd be sitting on somewhere north of $380,000. Without trying. Without reading a single book or sitting alone in a library at 10 p.m., the math was completely indifferent to how she'd gotten there. It didn't know she'd misread the form. It didn't care that she'd laughed about it. It only cared that she'd started at 27 and hadn't stopped the clock. Greed sat with that for a while. He thought about his own 20 years of discipline, the silence, the napkin arithmetic in the diner booth, and then he thought about Hana, clicking through a form in 4 minutes. The math didn't reward intention. It rewarded time. That was both the most encouraging and the most humbling thing he'd learned since the library. By 2015, the account was closing in on $120,000. Greed was 53. He'd been doing this for 11 years without telling a single person, and from the outside, nothing had changed. Same apartment, same Navy crew neck, same walk to work. Meanwhile, Theo had recovered from the dot-com disaster and pivoted hard into real estate flipping, which he described at every available opportunity as printing money. He had a new watch, a louder tie, and the particular confidence of a man who had forgotten he'd been wrong before. From where Greed sat, the arc was familiar. Not because he was wise, but because he'd watched it once already and knew how the second act ended. What he didn't know yet was how bad it would get this time. Patrice closed her office door before she said it, which told him everything before she opened her mouth. It was late 2016. Theo had taken a second mortgage on his house to fund a flip in a suburb east of Houston. A 4-bedroom he was certain would move in 60 days. It had been sitting for 8 months. The market had cooled without asking his permission. Patrice had heard it from Theo's wife, who had called her after the 3rd weekend the house hadn't sold. She wasn't gossiping. She was worried in the careful, pragmatic way Patrice worried about things, quietly, with her reading glasses off, which meant she was being serious. Greed listened. He said he was sorry to hear it. He meant it. He took the stairs instead of the elevator afterward, just to have somewhere to go with it. He stood on the second-floor landing and looked out the narrow window at the parking lot below. Theo's car in its usual spot, a black SUV with a bumper sticker from a home-flipping seminar he'd attended in 2014. What Greed felt wasn't satisfaction. He was clear on that. Satisfaction would have meant he'd been rooting against Theo, and he hadn't been. It had never even occurred to him to root against Theo. What he felt was more like grief, the low-grade kind, the kind you feel when something that was always going to happen finally does. Theo had never been short on intelligence. What he'd never been able to find was the patience to let something work slowly. And the market, as always, had no interest in rewarding impatience with a third chance. By 2017, his contribution was $300 a month. He'd raised it 3 times in 13 years. Each time a small raise came through, he moved a piece of it straight to the automatic transfer and didn't touch what remained. It had never felt like sacrifice because it had never lived in his checking account long enough to feel real. One morning, he opened his wallet to pay for coffee and found the index card still tucked in the back, creased into quarters, the ink slightly faded at the fold but still legible. The market has never, over any 20-year period in its history, finished lower than it started. He stood at the counter for a second longer than he needed to. He put the card back. He paid for the coffee. The sentence was still true. The only question was whether he'd be patient enough to let it stay true for him. Hana caught him on the rooftop at lunch in the spring of 2017 and held up her phone before she even said hello. $38,000. She'd been enrolled for 3 years, and the account had done what accounts do when you leave them alone and markets move. And she was looking at the number with the specific expression of someone who has found money in a coat pocket. Except the coat pocket was enormous. He told her not to touch it. She asked how long. He thought about the index card, about the diner napkin, about the particular discipline of doing nothing while everyone around you was doing something. And he said, "Until you think about touching it, then wait another year." She laughed like he was joking. He let her. October 2018. The market dropped and kept dropping. Q4 was the worst quarter in a decade, and the financial news ran out of ways to describe it as temporary before it stopped being temporary. Greed checked his account on a Tuesday evening and watched $22,000 disappear from the summary line in a number that didn't feel abstract at all. He sat with it for what felt like a long time, but was probably 4 minutes. Then he stood up, closed the laptops, put on his jacket, and went outside. He did not sell. He told himself he wasn't going to tell himself anything reassuring. He didn't need a pep talk. He needed a walk. He got a walk. The money was still in the market when he came back. That was the whole decision. The block was maybe 12 minutes end to end, and he'd walked it enough times that he didn't have to think about it. He passed Rosa's window about halfway around. She had the light on. She always had the light on when she was working, and she was at the easel with her back to the glass, a paintbrush moving in small, deliberate strokes across something he couldn't see from the sidewalk. She turned and waved, the way she always waved, like he'd only been gone an hour. He thought, standing there in the cold, about telling her the number. The real one. Not a rough figure, not "it's going okay." The actual balance, the $118,000 that had just dropped to $96,000 in 6 weeks and was going to go back up eventually. Or at least that's what the sentence on the card said. He didn't say it. The question she'd asked him in 2004 was still sitting in the air between them, patient as the math. One day he'd answer it. March 2020 arrived the way catastrophes tend to. Fast and then faster. The market dropped 34% in 5 weeks. Theo, who by then had moved everything into crypto after the real estate loss, watched his portfolio go first in the first week and panic sold the rest in the second. Greed heard this secondhand through the particular silence that falls over an open plan office when everyone knows something bad happened to someone, but no one wants to be the first to say it. He was working from his apartment by then, a laptop on the kitchen table, with the news running muted in the background. Markets in free fall, the word unprecedented every 12 minutes. And he made a decision. He was not going to look at his account for 6 weeks. Not because he wasn't afraid, because he knew what looking would tempt him to do. He looked in May. He made himself wait the full 6 weeks, 43 days by the actual count. And then on a Saturday morning, he opened the laptop and pulled up the brokerage tab. He sat down with his coffee still in his hand. The account was at $198. It had been at $211,000 in February, which meant it was $12,000 below where it had been before the worst crash in a decade. $12,000. He had not sold. He had done nothing. He had walked around the block and made coffee and gone to work on video calls while the news ran in the background. The market had simply come back because that was what it did when you gave it enough time. He sat very still for what felt like a long time. Then he drank the coffee before it went cold. He had 16 more months of contributions left before he ran the real numbers. He wasn't ready yet. He ran the real numbers in the spring of 2022. Not a napkin estimate. He sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad, a calculator, and the actual brokerage statement printed out for the first time in 18 years. He added the contributions. He checked the compounding. He cross-referenced the projection tool on the brokerage site with his own arithmetic because he didn't trust a computer to tell him something that large. $340,000. Compounding at current rates and continued contributions toward $480,000 by 65. He checked it again. Then a third time, because the number felt like something that belonged to someone else's life, someone who had made a plan, invested strategically, known what they were doing. He had done none of those things. He had set up an automatic transfer in a public library and then refused to panic for 20 years. Apparently that was enough. Apparently that had always been enough. He called no one. He sat at the table until the lamp felt too bright. Then he got up and turned it off and went to the bedroom. He didn't pour a drink, didn't send a message, didn't do the thing you do in movies where you sit on a park bench and let it wash over you. He just went to bed. The most consequential financial moment of his adult life, 20 years of contributions, 20 years of silence, 20 years of doing nothing spectacular, had passed in about 45 minutes of arithmetic at a kitchen table. He sat on the edge of the bed in the dark. He thought about the library. He thought about the index card in his wallet. He thought about Theo and whether it would ever occur to him that the boring option was still on the table. Then he turned off the light. He'd run the numbers once more in the morning just to be sure. The financial planner's name was Garrett Webb, and his office smelled like old carpet and printer toner. Nothing like the glossy wealth management suites you'd see in commercials. Greed had found him through a county directory, fee only, flat rate, no commissions. He handed over the printed brokerage statement without saying anything, and Garrett studied it for a long moment, the way a doctor reads a chart when the numbers are surprisingly good. Then Garrett set it down on the desk and looked up. You did this on automatic contributions and never sold. It wasn't a question. Greed said yes. Garrett said quietly, I don't see this often. Garrett walked him through the projection at 62, not a fantasy number, a real one, based on the balance and the contribution rate and a conservative assumed return. He said, Greed wouldn't be rich in the way people mean when they say rich. No lake house, no Lamborghini, but the alarm clock, that he could retire. Greed sat with his hands folded and looked at the window behind Garrett's shoulder, thinking about a thing he hadn't thought about in 20 years. What he would do with a Tuesday morning that belonged entirely to him. He didn't have an answer. That surprised him more than the number. Back at the office that week, Theo Barker was still at his desk. He was 60 now, reading glasses he'd never worn before balanced at the end of his nose, the gold watch still on his wrist, thinner than it used to look. The real estate loss had taken years to absorb. Then, the crypto crash had taken whatever was left of his recovery. He wasn't broken about it exactly. He'd always found a way to frame each loss as temporary, a stepping stone to the next play. But the next play kept requiring him to still be there, still working, still clocking in. He didn't know Greed was already thinking about walking out the door. Nobody did. Hana found him in the break room on a Thursday morning. She had her phone out before she'd even poured her coffee. Her account had just crossed $100,000. She was 35, and she'd never added a single dollar beyond what came out of her paycheck automatically. She kept saying, I didn't even mean to, like it was a confession. Greed told her she'd done the only thing that actually matters. She'd left it alone. She asked if she should do something different now, maybe move it somewhere smarter. He looked at her and said exactly what he'd said on the rooftop 5 years ago. Leave it, and when you think about touching it, wait another year. She'd never know, not really, what that sentence was worth. He handed in his retirement notice on a Wednesday, which felt right. Not a Monday, not a Friday, just a plain Wednesday in March. A single email to HR and a printed letter he left face down on Patrice's desk before she arrived. He cleared his things in about 20 minutes. There wasn't much. 2 books, coffee mug, the index card from his wallet. He thought about leaving that one, but he kept it. He carried the small cardboard box down to the elevator, rode it to the lobby, and walked out into the ordinary morning without telling a single person. 20 years. 1 browser window in a library. $50 a month, then $100, then $3. He didn't feel like celebrating. He felt like it was just the math, finishing its sentence. Patrice found the letter before 9. She walked across the office floor without saying anything, and he was still standing at his cleared desk, making sure he hadn't missed anything. She stopped in front of him, took her reading glasses off the beaded chain, and held out her hand. He shook it. There was a pause, the kind that means more than the words on either side of it. Then she said, I always thought you knew something the rest of them didn't. He almost laughed. He said, just one thing, and I had to read it in a library. She put her glasses back on and walked back to her office without looking around. That was enough. That was exactly enough. The last commute home was the same as every other one. Same blocks, same pavement, same bus shelter with the peeling transit ad he'd passed 4,000 times. He wasn't sentimental about it. What struck him walking those streets for the last time as a working man was how completely ordinary they looked. The number in his brokerage account had nothing to do with how the light fell on the concrete. It hadn't changed the color of the sky or the smell of the taco truck on Westheimer. The city was exactly what it had always been. That was the strange part. The inside of his life had shifted completely, and the outside hadn't moved a centimeter. He kept walking. Rosa was on the front stoop when he turned the corner, sketchbook open on her knee, a charcoal pencil behind her ear, her dark auburn hair loose and paint-stained as always. She looked up the way you look up at something you weren't expecting and then immediately were glad to see. "You're home early," she said. He stopped on the sidewalk in front of her and said, "I'm home for good." She held his eyes for a second, put the sketchbook down on the step beside her, and sat up straight. She didn't say anything yet. The afternoon light came down between the buildings at a low angle and caught the side of her face. And Greed thought about 2004, standing in almost the same spot, and how much had changed in exactly the same place. She asked what he was going to do now. He stood there on the sidewalk for a beat, the same pause he'd taken in 2004 when she asked him through the window if it had been a good something, and he hadn't known the answer. He knew the answer now. "Same thing I've been doing," he said. "Nothing exciting." Rosa laughed, a real laugh, the kind that surprises even the person doing it, and picked the sketchbook back up and shook her head. He almost smiled. He put his hands in his jacket pockets and kept walking. And somewhere in the background, automatic and indifferent and patient as it had always been, the math kept working. Here's the thing nobody tells you. The math was never the hard part. The math is simple. Anyone with a library card and a Tuesday evening can understand index funds in 3 hours. Greed proved that in 2004. What's hard is doing nothing spectacular while everyone around you is performing. It's watching Theo triple his money and saying nothing. It's seeing your account drop $22,000 in 6 weeks and taking a walk instead of selling. Patience isn't something you either have or don't. It's a practiced refusal, a choice you make again, quietly, every single time the market moves and your stomach tells you to act. Greed made that choice for 20 years. That's the whole story. Theo Barker is still at his desk. 60 years old, reading glasses, the gold watch, still paying off the last of the real estate loss, still scanning for the next opportunity that will finally make it all back. Hana Fujimoto's account is sitting somewhere north of $100,000 and compounding quietly without her attention. Patrice retired on her pension, which she had never once worried about, which she had also never once bragged about. And Greed, for the first time since he was 41 years old, has nowhere he has to be. Not tomorrow morning, not Monday, not ever again unless he chooses. The city keeps moving. The math keeps running. And somewhere in a library in Houston, a seat at a terminal is open, waiting for the next person who needs it. If you're sitting somewhere right now thinking you started too late, you didn't. Greed was 42 with $200 and a creeping shame that the window had already closed. It hadn't. The sentence he wrote on an index card in that library still holds. The market has never, over any 20-year period in its history, finished lower than it started. That's not a promise. No one can promise you the future. It's a record, a long, patient, boring record. The question isn't whether the math works. The question is whether you're willing to be boring enough, long enough, for it to work for you. You just have to stay. That's the whole instruction. If today is the day you want to understand how this actually works, not the concept, the real mechanics, the part that nobody explains clearly, the first lesson of Greedskingdom is free, and it's linked below. Not a course designed to sell you the next course. Just the mechanics explain the way a patient person would explain them to someone who actually wants to know. Greed didn't have that in 2004. He had a library and a primer and 3 quiet hours. You have something better. Start there. The math will wait for you. It always does. When Greed finally told Rosa what the number actually was, do you think she believed him? Drop your guess below.